The seventh wealth crusher. This is a big one. And again, I've made most of these mistakes myself. Certainly have made this one. It basically went nowhere for 26 years. That's called a lost decade. There's no real guarantee that we're going to come right back from any type of pullback. Hello, everybody. It's Mike Preston from New Harbor Financial. This week, we've got something pretty special for you. I'd like to present what I think are the top 7 wealth crushers that we'd love to help you avoid. And let me tell you from personal experience, I think I've committed almost every one of these. And if we can help you avoid even one of these, I think that we'll be happy and feel like we did a good job. So really in life, you don't have to do everything exactly right. You don't have to scrimp and save and suffer and go without. What you do have to do, or certainly I'd say what it's better to do, is to avoid some of these 7 big mistakes. The more of these you can avoid, the better it is. That's what we're here for. We're here with data and insight. That's our purpose, is to help you along. You can use our experience to your advantage. Please do remember to subscribe, leave your comments. We do read them, every one of them, and reach out to us. There's a link in the bio below where we're very happy to speak with you. We can help you through some of these issues. Even if you've already encountered some of these or made some of these errors already, we'd be happy to talk with you and help you understand how maybe to avoid more of them in the future. Stick around into the end. We will be talking about the biggest wealth crusher in our opinion, one that 85% of people make, and how to avoid it. Let's talk about the 7 largest wealth crushers. Some of these are going to hit home. Some of them won't be popular, but I just feel like from personal experience and from experience with hundreds, even thousands of clients and prospective clients, we have a unique insight as to what these biggest mistakes are. So this first one, you have to be delicate with this one because it's a really hard one to avoid. But from experience, I can tell you, and from the people that we talk to, one of the largest disruptive things that happens in a person's life is a divorce and or separation. Very hard to avoid this one because, a lot of us get married early in life and later on we find out that we're not compatible. So I really can't say exactly how to avoid this one, but if you can avoid this one, it's a big one. I can tell you this. You can avoid that. It's going to make a big difference in your financial life. I'm not an attorney, but I might say that you might want to consider something like a prenuptial arrangement. I know that's also not popular, but I feel like it's got to be on this list. So enough said on that one. The second wealth crusher would be ignoring the effect of compound interest. Compound interest is something that Albert Einstein, I believe it was him, famously described as one of the greatest phenomenons in the universe. It can be proven that if you start saving early, methodically, even if it's a small amount, but it's consistent over a long period of time, a lifetime, it makes a huge difference. If you ignore this, it's at your own peril. You don't have to be making a lot of money to have wealth at the end of your working years or in your retirement. You just have to start early and often. And so for a lot of people, this is what they're doing, putting money into a 401k, dollar cost averaging in. This chart shows the effect of compound interest. And effectively, if you just invest early and smart and consistently, and even if it's a small amount, you're essentially guaranteed to be rich. Take a look at this orange line. This shows a person at age 25 saving for 40 years at 8% compound interest, $10 a day. At age 25, if you start there, you're going to have about $1 million at age 65, retirement age. And that's only at $10 a day, probably less than the cost of a McDonald's meal these days. So it's a pretty easy, pain-free way to get rich. Now, a lot of people are doing this already through 401k contributions. I just wanted to illustrate how powerful it is. You don't have to make a lot of money to get rich. You just have to start early and make it kind of mindless. If it's only a 30-year period, and this would be akin to somebody that starts at age 30 and saves the same amount, $10 a day at 8% for 30 years, you'd have around $420,000. You'd have less than half the amount of money. So this really shows you just how powerful starting early is. Now, that doesn't mean that you're lost if you're 35 or 45 or even older and haven't started yet. It just means that you're going to have to save more. Thankfully, a lot of people when they're older are making more money. So don't get discouraged if you haven't started at age 25. Just reach out to us, give us a call. We'll be happy to go through some of these examples with you, do some calculations, help you get through potentially psychological hurdles that you might have to get started or even to amp up your savings. A lot of people are afraid to really even look at this. It's like being afraid to go to the doctor and being afraid of negative test results. Don't be afraid. Take a look at this with us. We can help you through all of that, and we're happy to do it. The third wealth crusher is assuming that all periods of time are the same. Take a look at this chart here. This is from John Hussman. He puts out fantastic data. This goes back 100 years. The blue line is the S&P index. What I want you to see on this chart, and this chart shows essentially how the S&P 500 lags the Treasury bond total return. But I'm going to make it even simpler than that. Take a look at the S&P from 1929 to 1954. It basically went nowhere for 26 years. That's called a lost decade, but in this case, that's a lost decade and a half or a little bit more. Another time that happened was 1966 to 1982. There's a 16-year period there that the S&P 500 did not make any progress at all. That's a lost decade and a half. And it happened again roughly 2000 to 2018, or more specifically 1996 to the low in 2008. Both of those periods were very close to 0% total returns. If you take a look at the 1996 to 2008, that was a notional return of near zero. John Hussman points out that between 98 and 2020, that the S&P total return lagged Treasury bonds. It really matters where you start to invest. Imagine if you retired and in 1929, you had to wait 26 years till 1954 to get your money back. This would destroy you. If you happen to retire in 1999, a tech bubble peak, you had a very rocky ride. Eventually you were all right. There's no real guarantee that we're going to come right back from any type of pullback. The green line that I haven't talked much about here that John Hussman points out is the level that the S&P 500 would have to be at to achieve 10% returns based on this model. And it's a model that we believe has a lot of validity. The S&P would have to be down here below 2,000 to produce 10% returns. That's scary. Can you imagine what would happen if we went down to that green line and stayed there for 10 or 20 years? Well, that's what happened before. So while this is not a good predictor of exactly when this can happen, I believe this model predicts that it's likely to happen at some point. So not every time in history is the same. And that's a big wealth crusher, to just assume that's always going to be the same. Assume that you can stay 100% invested and that it's always going to turn out okay. So be careful. The fourth wealth crusher on the list is paying too much interest on debt. Take a look at the average bank interest rate on credit cards. So this chart goes back to 1995. The long-term average was around 16% until the 2000s. During the years of zero interest rate policy, credit card debt went down to 12% or so, 12 to 13%, which was actually still pretty ridiculous, understanding that we were all getting around 0% for close to a decade based on zero interest rate policy. But look what happened here in the last couple of years. The Fed has went on a hiking program in the last year and a half to 2 years, and credit card interest rate on average nationally has exploded from 14% to 22%. So this is really crushing for anybody that holds credit card debt. There's a lot of negative effects to holding on to too much credit card debt. If you're just paying the minimum, you're essentially never going to pay off that credit card debt, and there's no way you're earning on cash that you would otherwise use for that debt close to this 21 or 22%. It's even worse if you have a late payment, then you get bumped right to the credit card maximum 28, 29%. Some tips to handle this is to think about refinancing debt into lower options. Sometimes you can do a balance transfer, and even if that balance transfer charges you 3% up front, which they often do, you can get away with refinancing and getting a lower interest rate. This is a very personal situation, so if you have some questions about this, just reach out to us in the link below and we're happy to talk about it. The fifth wealth crusher is paying too much for insurance. Insurance can be really expensive, and I'm not going to say that insurance isn't important. The concept of insurance is to pay a little bit of money or accept a small loss in exchange for avoiding a large loss. But sometimes people are just paying too much. For most people, permanent insurance is not a great idea, in my opinion. I know a lot of people are thinking that it makes a lot of sense because it's a forced savings plan. With permanent insurance, you're essentially overpaying for insurance in the early years and then using that extra cash to build more cash through interest. And then theoretically, you're able to take a net zero interest rate loans against it later, and you can use that money tax-free until you die. I understand that, but my opinion is the mortality and expense charges for the life insurance are too high, And frankly, a lot of people don't have a need for as much insurance as they're buying with permanent products. So the takeaway for most people, I would say 90 to 95% of the people out there should be looking at term life policies. And when you're young, you can get guaranteed level term policies for 20 or 30 years. When I was younger, I did a 20-year one. I actually did a couple 20-year ones. If you're in your 20s, you might want to think about 30-year level term. That would be a tip that I would strongly suggest that you think about. For property and casualty insurance, a lot of people are paying too much or they don't have the right insurance. You might want to take a look at having an umbrella policy. They're pretty cheap to add on to your homeowners and auto policies, and it covers $1 million or $2 million liability for basically everywhere in your life. You might have too much collision. Depending upon what type of car you have, you might be overpaying there. You could probably cut back on your collision and comprehensive coverage and or increase your deductibles. A lot of people should probably increase their deductibles. Not all insurance is bad. Make sure you have enough coverage, like using the umbrella policy. The sixth wealth crusher, not really a wealth crusher. It's maybe a missed opportunity. And it's not for everybody, but I think that everyone should think about at some point in their life, consider being self-employed. Not everybody can, but it makes a lot of sense. And it's a great independence factor. And some of the wealthiest people are self-employed people. Think about it at some point of your life, take a risk. And even if you're an employee, you can think like an entrepreneur and act like an entrepreneur because you essentially are your own business within that corporation. And if you're not treated properly within that corporation, you could take your business elsewhere. So think about that. Going back to the 1990s, I knew I wanted to be self-employed. My dad was self-employed. He owned a small photocopying business. I remember talking to, it was an American Express financial advisor at the time. He told me about his business. I became really interested in that. A bunch of years later, in the late 90s, I decided to leave my job as a chemical engineer and go work for a company called Payne Weber. And I worked as a broker, as an employee, but my long-term goal was to be self-employed. Then met my partner, John Loder, just a little while later. And John and I created this company, New Harbor Financial. And we're blessed by all of you, viewers and clients that support us. I encourage each and every one of you to think about it at some point. And we have lots of conversations a lot of different times with people talking about these things. And who knows, maybe if I could do it, every one of you can do it too. I'd like to think that. The seventh wealth crusher. This is a big one. And again, I've made most of these mistakes myself. Certainly have made this one. Putting all of your eggs in one basket. Now, how many times have we thought that we've got a great idea, and if a good idea is so good, might as well put all of your eggs in one basket, put all of your assets there. Well, if you're wrong, this can really hurt. If you're right, this can really help. The dichotomy of all of this is some of the wealthiest people in the world have put all their eggs in one basket and it worked. Think Jeff Bezos. He had a great idea and it worked. Think Bill Gates. So those are some great examples of how it works, but there's really many more examples of how it's a disaster. The average retail investor loses 85% of their initial investment when they go all in. To take a look at this chart, this is the mathematics of loss. And as you can see on the left side, these are the loss percentage. And on the right side, the gain that's required to get back to even. And the way that mathematics works is kind of funny. With each larger loss, you need a larger gain to get back to even. At 5 or 10%, it's not a big deal. Just a little bit more than 5% or 10% to get back to even. But look what happens as the loss goes up and up and up. 20% loss, 25% to get even. It gets really bad up here. 30% loss, need almost a 50% gain, 43% gain to get even. And if you lose half your money, you need to have 100% gain or a double to get even. And that only makes sense. And it only gets worse from there. If you lose 2/3 of your money, you need to basically have a triple to get back to even. So try to avoid the big losses. Warren Buffett famously said, the most important thing is not to lose money. Well, it's easier said than done, isn't it? But if you can do it, do it. And that's what our main focus is, or at least has been in recent years as we've approached what we think is probably the pinnacle of this bubble. It's very unlikely that you're going to pick the next big Microsoft or Amazon. It could happen, but it's just not worth it. Just because you can go 160 miles an hour on the highway in your car doesn't mean you should. I mean, it might be exciting, but one little misstep is going to be disastrous. Lastly, you may think that I'm going to say things to build your wealth like don't buy a new car, live below your means, skip your daily cappuccino. The truth is that some of these things can help. And I know that I'm probably going to hear some people say if you take the $5 or $10 from your daily coffee and put it into compounding interest, you can do very well. That's true. But not doing these things is not the biggest threat to your health. I think that the biggest threats to your financial health are some of these mistakes. These are often overlooked. These are the mistakes that I'd like to help you avoid. So I want to keep it real with you. Frankly, I think that we should all be a little bit more direct with each other. That's what I'm trying to do. Help people through the psychological challenges that they're facing. Building your wealth should not be a gamble. It's basically smart, thoughtful choices that accumulate over time and avoiding, if you can, the big mistakes. So if you found this helpful, don't forget to comment below with the wealth crusher that you're most determined to avoid. Also, stay tuned because in the next video coming up soon, I'm going to be talking about a list of the largest wealth builders, essentially the opposite of the largest wealth destroyers. And so I hope that you can avoid these mistakes. And if you've made some of them, don't feel bad. I've made, I think, 5 or 6 of them myself, almost all of them. So until next time, this is Mike Preston at New Harbor Financial. See you soon.